for decentralization on computers. This is going to be a much shorter one because there's a lot of, sort of overlap with the previous discussion. You can see the wall of shame there. Please go in there and add stuff to it. And with that, let's get started. So same thing here, except that this is about minimizing centralization across the software. So maximizing the number of physical computers composing a network, essentially. And just a very, very basic litmus test here that we want to be able to shut down the cluster and everything just works. But you can also generalize this. We want to have sort of a stronger network with more nodes. And right now we have this sort of our own little network, status network in a way, at least when it comes to Whisper nodes. And we need to figure out ways to sort of be more part of the Ethereum network, as well as to sort of strengthen the Ethereum network on its own. And this sort of is different from protocol to protocol and so on. But as a specific example, if you look at the Whisper spec, it's actually not a standard, and there are differences between GEF and parity. And there are also differences in terms of proof of work requirements and so on. So we are essentially the only ones running it right now, which is a problem. And just generally sort of strengthening the network to make it more robust. And it's something that we can measure and optimize for. And one of our OKRs is to have 50 status nodes, where we can be much more aggressive and push this up and sort of push for standards in the ecosystem. In terms of, sort of pairings and so on, one way of looking at it is decentralization and inclusivity. So I think Jacek mentioned this a few sessions ago, that people generally want to help out and run nodes and so on, assuming it's fairly straightforward. And this is also not a replacement for money, but it sort of can kickstart the process and so on. And there's also some points here around sort of, it's easy to get sort of stuck in this idea that you need to have sort of micropayments and so on, but there are sort of some concerns with this in terms of mental transaction costs. That the barriers to entry for people are more mental in terms of the accounting they have to do as a human in terms of setting up nodes and so on, as opposed to sort of strictly financial gains on a sort of micro dollar level. When it comes to continuance, this is sort of an ongoing debate in Ethereum and other parts of sort of the ecosystem. For example, there's no good incentives to running full nodes right now, which is a problem because there's sort of a lack of price models for various types of assets that are used in the ecosystem, like network and bandwidth and storage and so on. So that's sort of an open debate that's going on and how to solve that. For Whisper nodes, there's sort of no real incentives around them right now, and they're not on by default. And I think what we want to do here is we want to do a lot more on sort of the Ethereum level, so not just at sort of the status level, but engaging way more with sort of the EIP process and our core devs and so on, because that's how we're going to make something robust. And in terms of incentive design and so on, we can take inspiration from Ethereum 2.0, but there are also other sources like mechanism design. And these are like primitives like staking and slicing conditions, and also using sort of game theory, which is, for example, how BitTorrent works, where there's no sort of monetary transfer, but you still have like a mini reputation system within sharing a file, so people are incentivized to sort of contribute. But there are issues with that as well. And this also ties into things like subscription models and EIPs for that, and sort of, doing these types of things. That's a very, very brief one, and I didn't capture anywhere near the sort of complexity of this. So I think let's just leave it open. And is there someone who wants to say something? Let's just get started. Is someone here?
Yeah. I'm just thinking if this is relevant or not, but I'll take a stab at it. As I understand it, we've got the Whisper protocol, and then a layer above the Whisper protocol, we've got the status nodes, which are running a configured version of Whisper, and then the mail server software. Is the goal in terms of decentralization and decentralizing of the computers that we run on, I mean, is the vision essentially that we are going to have, or we are going to be building a communications protocol that's going to be kind of apart from Whisper? Because as I understand it, what's been really great about the client that Status has built is it's been able to show that running a chat app for people on top of just plain vanilla Whisper, it doesn't crack it, and it perhaps needs its own type of protocol in order to do the job, and perhaps we're the people to make it.
So I think we are like 27 people on this call. It would be great to hear opinions from as many people as possible. So perhaps the people who haven't said anything so far, do people have something to say? Maybe it can even be questions or thoughts or whatever. Just important to get some kind of wider participation, I think. So anyone who hasn't said something, anyone want to speak up?
Yeah, I mean, we currently use Whisper because it aligns with the principles, and we wanted to stick to the Ethereum stack. Are we limiting ourselves to only using Whisper for the entire future? I mean, as long as we align with the principles of being as dark as possible, and Whisper provides that, and it's part of what breaking Whisper does in terms of like figuring out how far we can go. Since we don't know that information, like what are we going to do if it doesn't go that far? Or, you know what I mean? Like, how do we move forward from that? Because right now, like we're somewhat, I don't know if we're, the process of decentralizing the computers relies on us running Whisper servers outside of Status, which means we need some type of higher, like larger privileged node that can operate as mail servers, so we don't have to run them. And that's potentially Status Desktop. That's potentially something people run that's incentivized. I think that's being worked on. But what if we find a better protocol that allows us to do all the things that Whisper does, but not require these things? Do we switch to it automatically? Do we stick with Whisper because it's part of the Ethereum stack? And I don't know, like I'd like some conversation here.
I don't think that it was ever limited to Whisper. It just so happened that we use it. And, I'm not here from the beginning, so I don't know the history behind it, but I think it's just more or less just a legacy that we are not also super happy with. So I think if there would be a better protocol, and there is a lot of talks about log-based communication as well, which is definitely not Whisper.
I think it's an open question. I just want to like reiterate, like this is like an active discussion, and I think it's a bit we're 20-30 people, and we have this sort of document for all the same. It would be really good if like every individual would sort of contribute to it, and it can even be something as simple as questions, because this is sort of supposed to be our wall of shame, and it's not supposed to be just 2-3 people talking. And even if you don't know a lot about it, just sort of asking questions and participating to the extent you can is valuable, because it's going to inform what we do as sort of a group. So please, if you haven't sort of contributed or something, just have a look there and ask questions or anything, because this is really discussion for everyone.
Yeah, I have a question actually. So on the topic of, to qualify breaking Whisper, and maybe we wrote this up somewhere, so maybe someone could just post a link somewhere if we have this written up. But how will we know if Whisper's breaking? Like if it starts to drop messages, especially with a lot of us leaving Slack and moving to Whisper, like, how will we know if like some just messages, we're hitting capacity and messages are not being delivered or they're being dropped?
I've made an outline on the path to figure that out. I'll post the HackMD link here in the chat.
Okay, thanks.
Is it also possible to use multiple paths, like just on as many as possible? Does that make sense? Or, I mean, can you just choose to use this on a variety of different, I don't know, channels?
It might be useful to have like more than one at the same time. Because, for instance, one could be good at real-time communication, another one would be good for offline messaging. It might work like that. So it just depends on what technical goals you want to achieve in terms of like traffic consumptions and things like this. Essentially, you're just paying penalty for each additional protocol. You're paying a penalty of supporting it and traffic and potentially security and privacy. So as long as these are balanced out, then yeah, we can use as much as we want. Or as many as we want.
I think perhaps one thing is that we have to focus very, very much on the chat application, but think about it like Ethereum is the vision of Ethereum is this world computer, right? And there you have, well, you have the economic model, and then but you also have a negotiation protocol that this was kind of meant to be. Not only for chat to happen, but also for applications to be able to communicate with each other. So perhaps that's an interesting aspect, coming back to the earlier discussion about us being an operating system. Like, what does an operating system offer to to its users or the applications that run on it, and what do we need to fulfill that? And what would we need? What's missing right now to develop apps as you develop them on a traditional operating system that we can do better in a more local way, where we still maintain these nice properties of failure being local, of communication being private, and so on and so forth.
Rachel, do you want to answer your point of view from the DApp team? Or someone else working on dApps, maybe?
Sorry, Oscar, I wasn't on the call. Could you repeat the question? I actually didn't hear.
Sorry, is it better now?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, cool. Sorry about that. So what I was asking, like, from the perspective of being a mobile operating system or an operating system in general, like, there are certain services that an operating system offers, and one of these is communication in general. And then it's not just chat; it's also communication for protocols, for apps, and so on, so that they can establish a service for the user. And we've been focusing our Whisper discussion very much on chat, but not so much on these other things that are needed in order to fulfill the vision of Ethereum being like this world computer, where that also deals with storage. It also deals with state, right? And the final part is communication. So as much as I like these log-based things for chat, and they make a lot of sense because failures are local, are we missing something by not also addressing it from a dApp perspective?
Yeah, that's a hard question for me to answer. I don't think I have an opinion on that.
So maybe maybe what's your point of view from the Embark side of things? Because there's been a lot of really cool work in terms of making it easier to interface with Swarm and IPFS and all these kinds of things. you have any thoughts on?
I honestly I didn't quite get what's being asked here exactly. So can I get some more clarification?
The way I answer the question is if you look at Status as an operating system and Ethereum as a world computer, if you use Linux or something, you have like a standard library and you have a bunch of services, and you can sort of use the sort of operating system to sort of do certain things. And it's not just chat communication; it's standard APIs to both to the sort of graphical interface, but also to device drivers and like storage and I/O and like security thingies and like peripheral devices and like all these kinds of interfaces that you can use as the app developer. And I guess Apple is another example with sort of the huge Cocoa Pods framework and all the kinds of things you can interact with from that point of view. So in terms of if you use that mental model, what's sort of missing or what is there or what should be developed further to get to the same kind of generality and usability for developers?
Right. So just about the Ethereum being a world computer, I actually am not really a fan of that analogy, although I know it was used in the token sale. I see it more as a consensus mechanism. So in the sense that dApps have different components that they use, Ethereum is one component, although a very important component. But the main goal is really to have a consensus mechanism, something that everyone agrees on what is the truth in the decentralized system, which is not quite the same as a decentralized world computer, although it kind of depends how someone interprets that. And in terms of dApps, one big thing that's still kind of missing is a good, I think, is a good transport layer. So people want to do things like from state channels to decentralized communication. There isn't still a well-developed, easily accessible to the average dApp, like transport layer, and which I think is something that Status could do and serve as a sort of like open platform. So I mean, if you want to call Ethereum a world computer, then I don't know, imagine Status was the world's communication network, so to speak, right? There could be a lot of possible dApps that we cannot even imagine if that kind of infrastructure was put in place. And I'm talking about Status here as a protocol and a platform, not necessarily just a mobile app.
About the user, in the user perspective, I see that Status looks more like something like Facebook, because at Facebook you also have like the apps. Apps inside of it that you can create an app to work inside of Facebook. But Status is way better because you don't force anything. Like we are more open than Facebook. We are all about this decentralization, but also we have the chat just like Facebook have, and then we have these apps. So I think it's an evolution to what Facebook is trying to do. But for the users, it should be the same final tool. It's for communication and for finding the apps. There is a lot of people that play games, that do businesses, and a lot of depends on the user. But you got the idea. So I see that for users, this is Status function.
I mean, isn't the cross section here really the notification service it's been chatted about in Slack, and I think one of the dev meetings, but something we're going to table for Prague is how could we create something in a decentralized fashion that allows dApps to send users notifications when stuff happens, which is pretty needed, especially given all the async communication with dApps.
Yeah, if we compare it to the operating system right now, the like Status or any other like the app browser like MetaMask or anything, you just imagine operating system like iOS 1 when you didn't have neither the background mode nor notifications. So it works while it's on the screen, but then it can't really notify you about anything that happens in the background. And I think that this is a critical. So any kind of background mode is very critical to any DApp user. So it might be in form of notifications via Whisper or something like that. So yeah, I agree with that.
Because from a technical point of view, there's this impedance mismatch between wanting to create a chat and wanting to use Whisper. Whisper is good for spreading knowledge in the network, but like peer-to-peer, it's really not. So I'm also thinking of it like, are there other use cases of Whisper that we're overlooking where it would be better suited? And then we'd use a different protocol for the chat specifically.
Do you mean beside other uses for Whisper besides chat?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean there's different anything that's to do with communication. It could be, I mean, state channels would be one of them. I talked to the Raiden guys about this, and they said they did experiment with it, but it didn't work too well. Although I don't think they are as good at dealing with Whisper as Status is, or doesn't have as much experience. That's one case, for example. There could be other cases with dApps communicating with each other. There's, for example, the gas relayer. I think Whisper is something that also a gas relayer can use, and other types like meta transaction type of services. I think we're going to see soon decentralized services that make use of, or could very well make use of Whisper. So I think chat is really just one of the possible applications.
I might be wrong, but I thought Whisper initially was about communication between dApps and sort of making that easy. So
yes.
I guess it's an abstract real-time communication protocol. You can essentially, but you can use it as a part of the chat. So if both people are online, it might be a faster way to notify people about new chat messages. So it's a real-time communication.
So yeah, I just want to say, when I say communication, I don't mean necessarily just chat, right? I mean,
no.
Yeah, okay. Because from a protocol perspective, it makes no difference if it's a person, application.
No,
English. Yeah.
I was talking more about, like, if a SIP protocol for, like, when you talk to each other, like the old one, it used to have two protocols in it. One is that actually sends you the data stream with my voice, and another one is about sending you different events about, so I started calling you and things like that. So any SIP has like two protocols. So for our chat, for example, for other applications, they can also combine Whisper as a like machine-to-machine real-time communication layer for like serving some events between people in a dark fashion. Again, what else can we think of that requires darkness there? So it should be real-time and darkness.
I actually looked at the actual portion of the paper that outlines Whisper use cases the other day. And yeah, one of them was DApp to DApp communication, but it listed some others. And it was interesting, in that same little section of bullets, one of the use cases it listed was for whistleblowers who want to stay anonymous and reveal information to the public. I thought that was an interesting use case.
Yeah, it could be like using darkness to just, instead of like mails or anything like that. Yeah.
Also, I think we shouldn't limit ourselves to just things that require darkness. Although obviously that's a good way to sell it, so to speak. But I think by default that should almost be the default, right? Like privacy should be the default. And then if it's a network that is a public utility, so to speak, then there's no difference between things that really require privacy and things that don't require privacy. There's no incentive to shut it down as much as before, because it's something that it's being used for everything. It's same as you can really shut down the internet just because it's being used for some bad things or things that you might not like, because the vast majority is for good legit use cases. So if that's the default, I think makes the whole network much more useful and in long term even harder to justify censoring.
Yeah, 100%. But there's the darkness. It also limits the scalability of the network.
Right. Well, is that something we can trade off like usual? People
right
can
now we are heavily trading this off, I think.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm wondering if you always, in terms of using a messenger, if you always need darkness, it makes sense in public chat rooms, but if two people have a direct message between each other and they both know the identities of each other and they have each other in their contacts, do they need to be using Whisper to communicate? Maybe they could use something a little less resource intensive for direct communication in such a use case.
I mean, it depends on what you want, because even the fact that me and you were communicating together might be enough sometimes. So
I have a question for non-technical people, or maybe people who are not engineers or work on this specifically. So one of the things we say is that status is decentralized and so on. So if you talk to friends and the family and so on, and is there something you mention, the word decentralization? And if you do, in what context do you say it? And how do you explain it? And do people understand it? I think that might be interesting to understand. Or I'm interested in understanding what people's experience with that is. Maybe someone hasn't said something as well. Or if you said, yeah, Rachel, go ahead.
I'll answer. I basically I just try to give an example of so basically I explain it as a system where there'd be no middlemen. And I say that you could imagine a lot of the applications or services used today existing without a middleman. And it's probably not the most ideal example, but I might say something like Airbnb, where I could rent your apartment for my vacation, but Airbnb doesn't handle the money or the transaction. It would be directly from me to you. And I don't think that's the ideal explanation for it, but that's typically what I do. It's a shortcut.
I'm kind
and with when people,
yeah, sorry, I was going to say I'm in the similar boat as Rachel with my friends, where it's I use the example, if they want to sell something, what platform do you go to, Amazon or something, and then you sell it to somebody. But then instead of in a decentralized world, if you wanted to sell something, instead of going to Amazon to sell your shoes, you just log into a portal and you can sell the shoes to somebody peer to peer that way, rather than you cut out the middleman.
And basically trying to explain it to them, in a way that would make sense for them. You're going to have less fees. There wouldn't be exactly fees. So that's why it would interest you.
And then the money gets directed to you. You don't have to go through PayPal, and then PayPal takes 2% of a cut of transaction or something like that, which I know they don't do, but it's more the person sends you the money and it's more secure.
So when I explain about decentralization regarding about status for the community, I mostly share or refer it as freedom, because you have freedom of controlling your own data, freedom of controlling your financials, and freedom to communicate in an easier way and decentralized way. And of course, what Rachel and Rajani just said, just eliminating the middleman from any transaction or user experience you're trying to get, even if you're trying to buy something, getting a service. But mostly I refer it to freedom, because at least for the Latin American community, that's something that really empowers us, and we see a really benefit of freedom in our systems that we are currently using. So yeah, that's what I use.
Cool, awesome. So I mean, do we feel like the technological choices we make, that's something that's accurate? Is it the same sort of level of abstraction, or does it enable the same things, or do people think it's like different questions with different layers? How do people think about it? How do we bridge these two sort of ways of looking at this?
What do you mean, like bridging the benefits versus the infrastructure underneath it?
No, I guess I mean like these are like real user stories in terms of sort of perceived benefits and so on. And then we're talking about this technology, but what is it for, and like how do we connect it? Like, is it serving our needs, so to speak? Just taking it from that angle and seeing if there's some connection.
Maybe not a good way of approaching it. It was maybe there's some way of bridging these two, or having more clarity in terms of what we're doing here, and if we're
I think in the real world,
logical choices. Maybe, I don't know.
I think in the real world, a lot of these things are intuitive. I mean, if I
does that frame make sense to anyone, or is it strange?
Yeah, but if I have a banana and I sell it to you, you give me money. I don't think about the fact that I'm using a centralized authority to control the value of that money. It's just like I'm giving to you, and it doesn't even enter the picture that there's a third party involved. And perhaps it's a little bit the same thing with these decentralized technologies that we're developing, is that when you look at the functionality,
and maybe technical people as well, what when you think about decentralization, like what does it mean to you? Like what are the hallmarks of it, and in what way are we not that right now?
I think it's also about, like, it becomes a little more technological, right? Like, because people understand the bananas, but in terms of like when things get a little more technical, like if you tell people, imagine a world that there isn't an Apple, or we could choose to not use an Apple or a Google, and teach you how to build your own tools that could give you your own version of a Google, like, and probably slowly going on that journey of like showing what that looks like very slowly, like even visually, right? Like having immediate feedback to a decision you make, or giving people, you know, this idea around, if my house is solar, I don't need to pay the electric company, right? Like with slow examples, but specifically probably more in our technology that shows if this message is dark or whatever, like you can see nobody's going to be able to intercept it. It's probably giving more like real visual, for me, applications of like, oh, I see the choice I've made, and this is it doing its job, rather than having a lot of this technical things that don't really always creep into people's everyday life. They need to see it in application, I think, in a simpler form.
I was trying to explain to some mates at the pub the other night what Status is, and I showed the app, and he's like, "Oh, it's like a chat app." I was like, "Yes, but it's like private, and it's permissionless, and it's secure." And he's like, "Oh, that's like a WhatsApp encrypt." I was like, "No, it's nothing like WhatsApp encrypt. It's decentralized." And then he was like, "Well, you know, what does that mean?" And I was like, "Well, basically, it means that they can't block your IP address. Like they blocked Telegram's IP address in Iran and took the service down." Which I think is theoretically true. I think practically that's probably still possible, but that's how I see it. Essentially, decentralization gives the product resilience.
One of the example of decentralization will be, for example, on Facebook. It's not you who choose the news you will get, it's Facebook. And same thing on Reddit, for example, and decentralization means that there is no one that filters the news out for you and might direct your own thinking, as was shown by Cambridge Analytica, for example.
I think that's a really good example for communication, because many of the people I'm trying to explain this to, they don't quite connect with like the benefits of decentralized and dark communication, because they're not suffering from any problems in that area. They don't feel that their communication abilities are restricted, or they don't feel that their communication is insecure. But I think a lot more people can relate to the example of sort of being fed a skewed perspective, the communication that we take in.
It's also then seems to be like maybe we could do a better job around these narratives, right? Because you have always different user cases where people find different degrees of things important to them or not. And it's almost like trying to have a good basis of an understanding of what people value and then how to show how these things apply value to that, right? Like your news is unfiltered, or your transaction, there's no fees involved, or you're safe, you can protect something that you find valuable to yourself. Maybe it's more in showing how that works.
Well, one point we raised in Basel was the fact that the technology we're building not for.
I can't hear you. Sorry. Do you mind speaking up?
Sorry, is it better now?
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thanks for saying. So one thing we talked about in Basel was the fact that the technology that we're building is not necessarily always for today, but it's also built with a perspective of how it could be used when things go wrong. So and it ties back a little bit to what Corey was saying yesterday, like if you can't be evil, you won't be. And the same thing goes with these decentralized technologies, is that in a situation where things go bad, how will this technology behave? And that's a good litmus test for thinking about whether to implement something or not, right? If this is taken over by a bad actor, what will happen? And this, even if it's not relevant to us today, we are spreading a technology throughout the world that will be there. And when something bad happens, we will not be in the position to change it. So we have to make that change ahead of time.
I agree, and that's an interesting property with Whisper as well, because if I remember correctly, it doesn't matter if it's all but 2 or 3 nodes are compromised, you still sort of get darkness. I'm not sure, but I feel like this might be different from Tor networks or mixed networks. Does anyone have any more technical insights into how they behave in terms of this type of thing where you can take over exit nodes and then you can infer things?
Yeah, so Whisper is, I guess, all nodes around you are compromised and you're compromised as well. But other than that, you're a little bit secure. It's a probabilistic thing at that point. So another important litmus test is the more special nodes you have in the system, the weaker it becomes. And I guess the property of a decentralized system is that most nodes are capable of handling more tasks. You don't have any special nodes, akin to an organization. In a hierarchical organization, you have a very strict limits on what certain people can do. And the same thing applies to computers, right? That from a decentralization perspective, the network becomes weaker the more specialized nodes you have. So the mail server is an excellent example of this. It's a specialized node and it performs a task that none of the other nodes are capable of. And that's why intuitively we're feeling that there's an issue with this. So these are things that I would look for when trying to add things to the wall of shame, maybe, or criteria by which I would evaluate whether something fits our mission or not.
I think there's a Go ahead.
I was just going to ask, those specialized nodes in that mail server, is that something, that would be like for storage, for example, something kind of heavy that something light couldn't couldn't hold, like images or pictures or videos. Is that what you mean?
Yes, as soon as you have those specialized nodes, you also need another mechanism in place to incentivize them to behave correctly. So in the case of Ethereum and blockchain, we have the miners that are incentivized to make sure that the network works well. This is kind of like a weakness at the same point, because it means that you do have these specialized nodes that are performing a task that can't do what the others can, and therefore make the network more fragile and like.
But is it not that those nodes need to become the new normal, in the sense that they're specialized because the regular Whisper network just won't do the job in terms of reliability in delivering messages, in terms of storing offline messages, and then when we start looking at other features like storing, say, heavier files like images.
In the specific case of mail service, the main reason they are specialized is because they have a high availability requirement, the way they're set up right now. So if you're offline, you're two people talking to each other, and you delegate the ability to store messages when you're offline, you do that right now to one specific node. And if that node is offline, that means that you lose messages. So that special node has to be online all the time. So it can't be another mobile phone, at least in the current setup, where it's a specific node that you choose. That's the reason why it's specialized. But it doesn't mean it has to be necessarily. It's just, that's the origin of that.
Well, the point is that in such a system, it's not necessary that all nodes perform all tasks. It's just that they're capable of doing so when there's no one better around.
Yeah. What do you think are the main blockers, especially, let's say that we have Swarm nodes and so on? Like, what do you think are the main blockers? Do you in terms of mobile nodes and having specific types of capabilities, like how do you see that being toggled? Like, that is essentially it's a full node by default, but then maybe you have some way of instrumenting that, well, this should be a light node? Or do you think how do you look at that?
Maybe this is where an economic model comes in, like where you stop using barter and you start using money, and maybe it's reasonable in those cases. Nonetheless, it's an interesting property to evaluate the system by, and then just to be cognizant of what kind of constraints you're introducing into the system. As long as you're doing it consciously and so on, and you have a way to measure the impact of it, you can make a rational decision about it.
I would also tell that we probably shouldn't underestimate the power of mobile devices in general, especially the modern ones. So I think that, yeah, if we would be able to think a little bit about this from ground up and to think about slightly better mobile suited nodes, they probably shouldn't be super light, because I don't know, you can buy an iPhone with half a terabyte of storage right now, and then you like the CPU power is pretty big, and same with like Pixels and other high-end phones. So on some mobile phones, the only two concerns are essentially the battery consumption and the traffic, and everything else is like it's not much like slower than your computer that you probably see, especially if you have a laptop. So maybe we should just think about how do, instead of trying to hack around things like, oh, we need to have desktop clients and things like that, maybe we should also think about how can we empower mobile nodes much more, because obviously there is much more of them as well. So
I guess with that, we should probably finish up. It's been an hour. Yeah, we have this sort of HackMD document. People can contribute wall shame and then we'll possibly discuss. I guess I just want to ask a question, like how do people think we can do better in terms of active participation for filling up the wall of shame? As an example, when we were in Basel, we were maybe 7 people and we managed to end up with like 30 items or something. So considering we're 30 people here, now we're 20, but we were 30 before. We only have like a few people filling it out. So what are people's thoughts on how we can make this more active and filling it out? Because it would be better to have more than less. What's blocking people?